What's up, guys? So today we're going to talk about AWS Lambda functions, the common use cases, and how to create your first Lambda function on AWS. So number one, what is AWS Lambda? Well, it's a compute service where you organize, store, and run your code without having to provision or manage servers. That means you don't have to worry about the operating system, updating, or any of that. AWS takes care of that. All you have to do is store and organize and manage your code. AWS Lambda has a highly available compute infrastructure, meaning it will scale up and down based on the number of invocations or the number of times it's been triggered. You pay for what you use, and Lambda only runs when it's invoked. Lambda functions support all major languages, such as C#, Python, JavaScript, and a lot more. Some common use cases for AWS Lambda includes file processing, data and analytics. Websites and mobile applications typically have some back-end logic that you can put into an AWS Lambda function, and you can invoke that Lambda function through an API gateway, or you can invoke it directly by using the new feature called AWS Lambda URLs, where you can call the URL in your application on Postman or through the browser, and you can invoke that Lambda function. Also, scripts and tasks that don't take up more than 15 minutes would be ideal, as Lambda functions are configured to execute in a window of 1 second to up to 15 minutes. So anything above that range of 15 minutes, the Lambda function would not be ideal. Things like web scraping or some small little script that doesn't take more than 15 minutes would be ideal for Lambda functions. So how do you create an AWS Lambda function? Well, there's 5 different ways to do it. Number one, you can go through the AWS Management Console, which is their UI. You simply log into your account and you go into Lambda and create that resource. The second method of creating is the command line interface that AWS offers. You simply download the CLI tool and you're able to issue commands using their APIs. And all that takes is configuring your credentials through the CLI, and you're able to make those calls. You're also able to make Lambdas using their CloudFormation or CDK. They also have SDK, software development kits, and also you can use AWS SAM or their serverless application model. For the sake of this video, we're going to show the first 3. So I'll show you how to make a Lambda through the Management Console or their UI, the CLI tool that they offer, and finally I'll show you how to create a Lambda using their CDK. So let's jump right into it. The first way you can create a Lambda function is by simply going to the Management Console. Simply navigate to aws.amazon.com, log into your account, go to the top left bar, the search bar, and type in Lambda. After doing so, you select the service, and on the left hand side you'll see this Functions tab. Hit that, hit Create Function, and you'll be met with 4 different selections. So you can create a Lambda function from scratch, you can use a blueprint. So as you can see, this Lambda application will have some sample code and the configuration preset for you. So there's a lot of commonly used Lambda functions, and instead of having to create it from scratch, you can select one of these. You can see there's 48 of them. You can select one of these and all the configuration and the sample code will be inside of your Lambda function pre-configured for you. We have the container image, so you can specify the ECR URI, which contains your Docker image, and you can use this Docker image inside of your Lambda function. Lastly, you have the serverless app repository. So as you can see, there are public application and private applications that you can leverage instead of having to create one from scratch. So let's do the author from scratch option. Let's type in a function name, so Lambda creation console, right? Console, and we will select our runtime. As you can see, there's a lot of selections: .NET, Go, Java, Node.js, Python, and Ruby. In our case, we'll do Python 3.9. You can select the architecture, and here we have our execution role. So this execution role will define all the permissions that this Lambda will assume and leverage. So we can either let AWS create a brand new Lambda execution role, and that will be used. It has basic Lambda permissions, and that will be used to those permissions will be used by the Lambda. We can use an existing role that we've created in IAM, or we can create a brand new role and select policy templates. So these are just templates that have configurations for the respective resources, right? So this is SES resources, S3 object read-only permissions. So there's a bunch of policy templates that you can select from. So we'll do create a new role with basic Lambda permissions. If we go to the advanced settings, enable function URL. So this is a brand new feature where you can invoke the Lambda directly from a URL instead of invoking this Lambda through other services. So typically, if you wanted to invoke this Lambda, you would do it through an API gateway, an SQS, or other services. Instead, now you can actually directly invoke it by hitting an endpoint through your browser, Postman, or your application, right? So we'll enable that. The authentication type for now we'll just do none. We won't require specific AWS users or accounts. We'll just allow everybody essentially to access this endpoint. It will be public. You can enable cores. For this case, we won't need that. You can enable a VPC, so connect your function to a VPC to access private resources during invocation. We're not going to need that, and then you can enable tagging if needed. So we'll hit create function. And as you can see, it takes some time. It's going to load a little bit. So we'll let that finish. Once this Lambda function is created, we can take a look at some of the basic things. So as you can see, this is the code that we have. It's just a simple function, and it returns, the status code and just the body. So if we hit test real quick, and we give it a event name along with the JSON, and we hit save, and we hit test, you can see that it successfully works, right? So now we can quickly take a look under configurations, under general configurations or permissions, sorry. You can see that the execution role was created, and if we open this up, we can look at the basic Lambda permissions that it defined. So in here, you can see Lambda creation console role. This is the execution role. And if we open up that policy, you'll see the basic permissions. So creating logs, creating a log stream, putting events, and along with the resources. So this is a basic execution role. So if we go back to the Lambda, obviously we enabled the function URL. So if we copy this function, we can simply invoke it in here. We hit enter. As you can see, hello from Lambda. It is working. It is public. Anyone can hit this endpoint and it will return this data. So as you can see, you could put your respective code in here and simply call it through endpoint, through Postman, or through your application, and it will execute any logic that's inside this function. So this is how you create a Lambda function. You configure it properly in your management console. So let's go on to the second one, which is the command line interface. Creating resources through the AWS CLI tool is extremely easy, and a really good resource to have is the AWS CLI command reference website. The website on the main page contains all the services that AWS offers, along with the commands to create those services. Instead of creating resources manually, sometimes it's good to have a list of commands, CLI commands, that you can rerun in case anything happens to your infrastructure. Let's say in the future you want to replicate a certain infrastructure. If you have all the commands, the CLI commands, you can easily recreate that entire infrastructure rather than having to go back or manually create those resources. So if you navigate to the main page for this website, you will see all the different services that AWS offers. In our case, we're going to be creating a Lambda function. So if we simply navigate to the Lambda function and scroll down, we can see all the different available commands. So for the purposes of this video, we're going to look at the create function command. And if we scroll down in the synopsis, it will show us all the inputs that we can, or all the flags that we can pass. So for instance, if we want to name our function name, if we want to define our runtime, if we want to define our execution role, and a bunch of different parameters. If we also scroll down, it gives us the options along with a detailed explanation of what each of these flags mean. So for the function name, obviously it's pretty self-explanatory. This would be the name of the Lambda function, and you can type in the ARN, the partial ARN, or the actual function name. So you can pass in different formats. For the runtime, obviously, you can pass in these possible values, and if you keep scrolling down, it lists the rest of the flags. The second command, I think that's important, and I will show you, would be the create function URL config. This actually sets your Lambda up with a function URL. Rather than invoking this Lambda function through other services, we can directly invoke this function through the URL so long as we pass this command. So it's AWS Lambda create function URL config. If we navigate over to the repository that I will be uploading on GitHub, under the CLI directory, you will find there are 3 files. The first file is the execution role that we will be using to create our IAM role. The second file is our index.py, which is going to contain the logic for our Lambda function. It's very simple. We're importing JSON. We have our Lambda handler function, along with just a return statement that returns the status code and the body. Furthermore, we have the txt lambda creation CLI file. This will include the instructions on how to create a lambda using the CLI tool. Number 1, we're going to create an execution role, which we have over here. Number 2, we're going to create the index/main.py file, which will have our code inside. That's going to be right here. The third step is we're going to zip the contents of the index/main.py file to a zip folder called lambda.zip, and we will use that with this command. The fourth step is to create the actual execution role using the AWS CLI command, AWS IAM create role. We're going to pass a role name called lambda function execution role, and we're going to pass the assume role policy document, which is the path to the actual execution role, as you can see over here. Next, we're going to attach a basic execution role policy. This is a AWS managed service policy. So if we look AWS IAM attach role policy, we're going to include the role name that we just created up here, right? Which is lambda function execution role, and we're going to pass in the policy ARN, and that ARN is essentially the actual service, the service role that's managed by AWS called AWS Lambda Basic Execution Role. So if you go into your IAM console, you type in the service role that's managed by AWS, this right here, you will find that in your account. It's in every AWS account. The sixth step is to create the actual Lambda function. So we'll call the AWS Lambda create function. We'll pass the function name. We'll pass the runtime, which is Python 3.9. We will pass the zip file that we zipped up in step 3, I believe. In step 3, yep. So we're going to pass file B, which is just binary, and then the path to the lambda.zip. Since we haven't done that, this would not work, but I will walk through in the tutorial how to do that. Then we're going to pass the handler name, which is just going to be index.lambda_handler. And we're going to pass the role ARN, which we created up here on step 4. So as soon as we create this role, I'll go into my IAM console. I'll get the ARN, and I can pass the ARN in here. And the last step is to add the function URL configuration, so we can call the actual function URL without having to call it through another service or through the actual AWS console. We can essentially call it through the URL. So let's jump right into the CLI and start creating these resources. Navigating over to the Windows command prompt, I went inside the Lambda CLI directory, and inside, if I type in dir, I will see all the files and folders that are within this directory. We have the execution role, the index.py, and the instructions text file. So if we go back over to the instructions, the first step is to create the execution role. That already exists over here. The second step is to create the index.py file that contains your Lambda code. That's already been created for you. You can add your own code inside here. The third step is to zip the contents of the index.py file to a zip folder called lambda.zip. So the command is right over here, so I'll copy that over. And I'll switch over to my terminal. If I run that command and I check, that lambda.zip folder is created. So going back to the instructions, step 4, let's create the Lambda execution role. So we're going to create the role using the execution role.json file. So let's switch back over to the terminal. We're going to hit enter here, and boom, we can see that the role was created. So now if we switch over to the AWS console, we can just validate really quickly if that was created. So I'm going to refresh my IAM console page, and we'll look up the role name, which is lambda-function execution role. So now if we look inside, this is in fact the role that we just created, and as you can see under the trust relationship, we give this role the ability to assume and use the service lambda.amazon.com. So going back over to the instructions, the next command would be the attachment of the basic, let's delete this over here. We're going to attach the AWS service role called AWS Lambda Basic Execution Role. So now if I switch over to my command prompt, I will pass that command in. And we can validate really quickly if that actually occurred on the console. So if I refresh this page, we can see if that service policy was attached, and as you can see, the AWS service policy, managed policy, has been attached. And as you can see, the Lambda can now create log groups, put log groups, and create log streams. So now let's go over to the instructions again. And let's take a look at the creation of the actual Lambda function. So we'll copy this over here. And before we do that, actually, we have to pass in the ARN of the role. So if we navigate back to our console, we will find the actual ARN. So over here in the Lambda function execution role, the ARN was created. So we'll copy that over here. And we'll navigate back to the instructions, and we can pass the ARN right over here. So we'll copy this, and we will go over to the terminal, run that, and boom, as you can see, the function name was created, the function ARN, the runtime, the role that we created initially, as you can see we attached it properly, the handler name, the code size, and a bunch of other information. So just to finish this off, let's create the actual AWS Lambda function URL. We'll copy this over, and we'll run it. Oops, looks like I had something in front. And as you can see, this Lambda function now has the ability to be called directly with this function URL. So if we copy this over, we can actually run it. If you hit that endpoint, you can see it returns hello from Lambda. So as you can see, we created this Lambda function, we attached the function URL, and now we're able to successfully call it from the browser through Postman and other means. So that is how you create a Lambda function and the IAM role and everything associated with it through the CLI. I hope that was helpful. Now let's go on to CDK. CDK allows developers to create resources and infrastructure using languages that they're familiar with. In this case, we'll use Python. And in the same repository, which I have the link in the description, if we navigate to the app.py file, this is the starting point for the CDK project. I define the account ID and region, which I pull from my environment variable. I'm going to keep it hidden for now. And I pass the account ID and the region to the Lambda stack, which we'll be creating, and it will contain all of our resources and infrastructure needed to create the Lambda function, along with the IAM role and the function URL. So a couple of the properties that we pass is the app, the constructor ID, the environment variables, which are account and region, and the stack name. So if we go into the Lambda stack, this is where we're going to define all of our resources. So the first thing that we're going to need is a AWS IAM role. This IAM role is going to be the execution role for the Lambda. This execution role has the following properties. The most important ones being assumed by. We have to pass the service, which is going to be Lambda. We're passing the role name, which I define up here. We're also going to pass the inline policies. These are going to be the basic IAM policies that's needed for every Lambda execution role. The policies include log permissions, mostly log permissions, right? So create log, log stream, and put log events. And we define the resources that it has access to. So the second thing we define is the actual Lambda function itself. We pass where the code lives. As you can see, the the directory where the code lives is under lambdas. So if we look over here under lambdas, we have the lambda testing.py, and this simply holds a handler function that returns a status code and a body. So this is where the actual code lives, and you can make changes to the code and deploy it as many times as you want. Going back to the Lambda stack, we define the handler name. The handler name is a reference to the actual file name. So as you can see, the file name is lambda_testing. So in your handler, it would be lambda_testing.handler. We also define the runtime, which is Python 3.9, and we define the function name along with the timeout and the role. So the role we obtain from up here. So the AWS IAM role is created, then we can reference that and then pass it to the actual Lambda function. Lastly, we create the Lambda function.add function URL. So this allows us, it's simply a method that we're going to access for our Lambda function, and we're going to add the function URL. We give it the auth type of none, since we don't care about specific AWS accounts accessing our Lambda function, since we're going to delete it anyways. So after doing so, you can simply go into your console and type in CDK deploy. After doing so, you'll see something like this, where it will publish your resources successfully to your AWS environment. After doing so, we can navigate over to the AWS console. If we go over to Lambdas at the top, click the service, and then if we go to the functions, you can see that the actual Lambda function was created. We can copy the function URL and then go into our browser and simply hit it. And as you can see, the Lambda function was created successfully through CDK, and it's working. So the function URL is working. If we go down to configurations and we go under permissions, we can see the actual execution role that we created. This is the IAM role that we created in our CDK project. And if we go to it, we could see the basic execution role permissions that we created, along with the trust relationship and the service that we define, which is lambda.amazon.com. So that is how you're able to create a Lambda function and attach a function URL using AWS CDK. I think this is probably the best method, as any changes that are made can simply be done within the CDK project, and those changes can be committed, and it allows developers to know exactly what's going on with their infrastructure. Furthermore, deploying this exact infrastructure to a different account or to a different stack name is as easy as changing the stack names in the app.py file. So for instance, if you wanted to deploy to another AWS account or environment, you can simply change the account ID and or the region. And if you wanted to recreate the same exact stack, you could just rename the stack and deploy it. So that's the advantages of using CDK. I highly recommend it. In my opinion, it's better than the CLI commands, and definitely a lot better than creating the resources manually. There's a lot less risk, and there's a lot more safety and reliability using CDK. So I hope you guys found this tutorial informative. There will be more videos like this in the future. So if you like it, please subscribe, and thank you.